Rolling.
All right, hello and welcome everybody. This is the talk on From Joke and Caricature to Serious Character, the Jewish Vampire in Literature. My name is April, that's my pen name. Another of my pen names is Dracula. And if you look at the author of my book, this is my first book, Heart of the Deep Cave and Other Romantic Vampire Tales. I have both names, April Dracula. I use it, one as a first name and one as a last name. Not all of these stories are in the category that I'm going to be talking about today, which is Jewish vampires in literature. So my interest in the subject got started when I was writing the one story in there that is in this category, which is called A Vampire in Auschwitz. And that came to me because after some dialogues I had with Jewish friends that went sort of like this. Have you ever heard of the famous Holocaust survivor and memoirist Elie Wiesel? Okay, some of you have heard of him. He died just a few years ago at age 87. And I've asked several people this question: where did Elie Wiesel come from? And they go, not sure. Then I would ask, okay, where does Count Dracula come from? And they will all go Transylvania. And I would say, well, you just answered the first question. Elie Wiesel does in fact come from Siget in Transylvania. And I have a CD called The Lost Jewish Music of Transylvania. Apparently the gypsies in the area preserved a lot of Jewish music because there was exchange of melodies between Jews and gypsies in Transylvania. So I got started thinking about, on the one hand, the real Transylvania and the lost Jewish communities that perished during the Holocaust, and the fictitious Transylvania and Bram Stoker's novel Dracula. And so I was thinking, vampires, Holocaust survivors, and my muse came forward and said, here's a great idea for a novel for you. I want you to write about a vampire who's a Holocaust survivor. And I was shocked. I was like, oh my God, that is the worst idea you ever gave me. No, please, no. Well, she said, oh, yes. And as I have learned, there is no saying no to my muse. As an author, if any of you write, you know what that's like. Once the words start writing themselves out in your head, if you don't put them down on paper, you could lose your mind. Or at least lose whatever semblance of sanity you show to the outside world. So, I started writing it. And as I was writing it, I was writing a story that took place mainly in the 21st century, a love story, but it had a lot of flashbacks to Holocaust scenes. And so I had to do some research, and of course that was soul-searing. And one of the ways I kept my sanity is I was thinking about, okay, now how would a vampire deal with this aspect of camp life? How would a vampire deal with that one? And the vampire I was writing about was female. And so I also had to do some research on the women's life there, and I found this book, Different Voices, Women in the Holocaust. You can take a look at the books I brought later near the end of the talk. And so as I was writing this, I also started thinking, well, gee, am I the only person who's had this idea? For that matter, am I the only person who's written about Jewish vampires, period? I knew that there were a lot of jokes about them. See, I was raised Jewish. I'm still culturally Jewish, even though I'm also a practicing pagan or Wiccan. In fact, I wear a number of hats. I'm also the organizer of a local group of real-life vampires, which are a different thing from the fictitious type. And if you want to ask me about that, we can talk about that after the main talk, because this is a talk about literature. The real-life variety is another subject altogether. But in any case, so when I was a child going to Hebrew school, my mother taught me how to say Dracula hu Drek, which means Dracula, he is dirt. We hear about Star Drek, but we don't hear about Count Drek or Count Dracula. Okay, but I thought that was really funny. My mother also told me a joke about a traveler who goes to an inn in a rural town in Transylvania where people are kind of superstitious, so he sleeps with the candle on, with the candle lighted near his bedside. Because he's kind of afraid. Sure enough, he wakes up in the middle of the night and there's this fanged cloaked creature leaning over him with a kind of a thirsty look. So he pulls out a crucifix, and the vampire says, "That won't do you any good, I'm Jewish." And My mom eventually made her variation on that. She has the guy come with arms out with 5 different religious symbols. So he pulls out a crucifix, that won't do you any good. Pulls out a Star of David, that won't do you any good. Pulls out a Muslim symbol, a Buddhist symbol, a Hindu symbol, that won't do you any good. Finally, he pulls out a communist symbol, and the vampire backs off and says, "I don't suck, fellow comrades." So those were the jokes. And so the whole idea of a Jewish vampire really started out as kind of a joke. Unfortunately, it was more than a joke for some people, namely anti-Semites. But there's something we have to remember, and that is historically, the idea of the blood libel, which is the accusation that Jews murdered Christian infants and used their blood in ritual matzahs. That idea was promulgated in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance. That idea started out completely separate from the idea of vampires. Okay, so like vampires were over here, that's about people's fear of the dead. Over here was the blood libel against Jews, which is basically people's fear of the other, people who are different from them, different religiously, different culturally. So the ideas were not the same. But there did eventually come a point in the late 19th, early 20th century where some nasty people started to merge them. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to show you a slideshow talking about how a lot of these ideas developed. All right, so here, as I said, is the typical joke image that we get. And and just a variation on that theme. Andre is here. Here's Bela Lugosi looking at a crucifix, but somebody put an Andre is there up there as a joke. That's Yiddish for, oh, woe is me. So, now, as I also said, there's really the dark side of this. There were anti-Semitic caricatures. This one, some people have told me, is really supposed to represent the devil as a Jew and behind the mask of Stalin. At first when I saw this, I thought it was an ugly caricature of a Jewish vampire biting Stalin on the back of the neck. But then it was pointed out that the Stalin mask is actually being lifted off his face, and it's a mask. So it's actually a Nazi image of what looks like a Jewish vampire to me. Now maybe it's supposed to be a demon, or maybe it's supposed to suggest both. That's entirely possible. But that didn't come about until, well, the Nazi era, pretty much. So, let me talk just a little bit about the history of vampire fiction. And before we get on to Jewish vampire fiction, this is Lord Byron. And as some of you may know, he was one of the great poets of the 19th century. Of course, he was not Jewish, most of them weren't. And one thing he did is travel extensively in Greece and in the Near East, and he picked up a lot of folklore, including the lore of vampires. So he wrote about that in his poetry, and he also had footnotes in which he talked about the folklore. So he actually did some study as a folklorist, which interests me, not just because I've got an MA in English, but also because I have a BA in anthropology, so as it interests me from a cultural anthropological perspective. The irony is that he made his greatest contribution to vampire fiction as the model for a vampire. So let's see the next image. The next image is John William Polidori, who was Byron's physician. They were good friends for a while. Some people have speculated that they were both bisexual and therefore more than just friends, but the evidence for that is a bit scanty. Polidori had aspirations to be a writer, and after he had a falling out with Byron, he wrote a famous story called The Vampire, which was published in 1819. I'll show you the frontispiece here. Oops. Okay, this is the frontispiece. As you can see, it was published in 1819, which means next year will be its bicentennial. And in it, he described a character called Lord Ruthven. The name is spelled R-U-T-H-V-E-N. Some people pronounce it Ruthven or Ruthven, but it's actually supposed to be pronounced Ruthven, who was a Scottish nobleman and based in a lot of ways on Lord Byron. And so What Polidori's contribution was, is he was the first to create a vampire who was an aristocrat, a nobleman. It used to be in Eastern European folklore that vampires were the absolute dregs of society. They were suicides, they were vagrants who died at the roadside and their bodies were never identified, or they were people whose families were too poor to give them a good Christian burial. Those are the people most likely to become vampires after death in Eastern European lore. Polidori was lampooning Lord Byron, whom he'd come to dislike. They had a falling out. And so he created this pale, beautiful, irresistible to women Lord Riven. And that created a craze, which pretty much went on throughout the 19th century and eventually led to Dracula in 1897. Just for comparative purposes, I might have used the wrong word. Okay, here's a book I brought for show and tell. It's called After 90 Years by Milovan Glizic. This was written 17 years before Stoker's Dracula, which means it was written quite a bit after Polidori, but it's based on very indigenous Eastern European folklore. Let me show you the back of it. Come on. Okay. It says a classic of vampire literature. Milovan Glizic, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, never before translated story is about Sava Savanovic. And Sava Savanovic is not a pale aristocrat, he's a red-faced peasant. So, because this is based on, indigenous Eastern European folklore of the Baltics, so there's a number of contrasts between the indigenous idea of the vampire and the most famous one that's come down in literature today, which is basically because of Polidori's tale. And so that's the contrast. And this book, which is actually very short, it's more like a long short story than a novel, is really a marvel of folklore and translation. There's footnotes in it, there's an introduction to it. I highly recommend it. It shows not just folklore, but a lot about indigenous village life. So it's really, really a remarkable work. And so, throughout the 19th century, then the vampire aristocrat, who's pale and beautiful and irresistible to women, became the norm in literature as opposed to folklore. Literature is usually with a known author, not always, but usually, and is published, whereas folklore is lore that goes back to the mists of time, some time immemorial. Okay. Unfortunately, that idea of the evil vampire began to merge. Here's a fanged Jew, he's obviously got a Star of David. This is, again, Nazi propaganda. But this was a merging of two distinctly different streams of thought. Because originally, vampires and Jews were, the concept of the evil Jew and the concept of the evil vampire were pretty far apart. But eventually they merged in late 19th and early 20th century. Now, one reason for this, and I'm showing you here the front flap rather than the front cover because the front flap is more interesting. A book called The Man-Eating Myth by W. Ahrens. This is a book I studied back when I was working on my BA in anthropology. And this book argues that people attribute blood drinking and flesh eating to any groups that they don't like. The tribe across the mountains, the non-Christians in their midst. So what this does is it locates the fear of Jews and the blood libel attributed to them in a larger context. So that's the interest of this book. And so, let's see here. Okay. This is Max Schreck, the actor. And he's the man who played Count Orlok, or the Vampire Count, in the earliest surviving vampire movie, the 1922 film Nosferatu. That's what he actually looked like. this is what he looked like when he was made up. And I don't know whether or not F.W. Murnau, who made the movie, was a conscious anti-Semite or not. I have read that Bram Stoker, who wrote the novel Dracula, was not a conscious anti-Semite. In fact, he took part in a rally or letter writing campaign in favor of Jewish rights. So consciously, he may have been a philo-Semite. But if you look at the description of Count Dracula in the novel, who's read the novel? Anybody? You read. Okay. He has kind of a high bridged nose. There's certain features that are both Eastern European and Jewish. So the scary part is it shows how sometimes even a person who isn't consciously racist or consciously anti-Semitic will nonetheless introduce some of these stereotypes or caricatures unconsciously into his writing. So, moving right along. Now here we have an image that is probably familiar to you if you've been in any Walgreens at this time of year. This is a vampire medallion that you'll buy. It's sometimes called a Dracula medallion. And it's typically an 8-pointed star. Sometimes 4 of the points are shorter than the others, sometimes they're all equal. And this is very similar to the medallion that you see Leslie Nielsen wearing in the comedy, in the Mel Brooks comedy, Dracula, Dead and Loving It. However, if you look at the place where the first time the medallion appears on Bela Lugosi in the 1931 movie, Dracula, just look at the medallion here. What does that look like?
Star of David.
It looks like a Star of David to me.
Solomon.
Yeah, or Seal of Solomon, yeah. So, a number of Jews have been kind of unnerved at that. There is something from the Psychology Today article about Dracula that I would like to read. Stoker's novel was itself part of a literary movement called invasion literature, a genre that included more than 400 books, many of them bestsellers, in the period from 1871 to 1914. Invasion literature was driven by anxiety about hypothetical invasions by foreigners. H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds is the prototypical and best-known work. An anxiety that Stoker deliberately, pardon the pun, stoked with his tale of Dracula, who polluted the English bloodline both literally and metaphorically. Indeed, what did distinguish Dracula from his vampire predecessors is that his attacks involved not only the possibility of death, but the actual loss of one's identity, or racial identity. As John Stevenson remarked in A Vampire in the Mirror, Sexuality, Basics of Dracula, blood is not just food, semen, and a means to eternal life, but also a crucial metaphor for racial identity. If you look on the back of your handout, Dracula's threat, Stevenson argues, is not mere miscegenation, the mixing of blood, but deracination, that's pronounced right. For Dracula's sexual partners become pure vampires with loyalty to Dracula, not to Britain. Okay, so we've seen so far how the concept of the vampire developed from Eastern European folklore through Byron and Polidori, and then how it started to, basically with Stoker, include some, I guess you'd call it xenophobic aspects. Up until Stoker's novel, most of the vampire literature in the 19th century was just fear of the dead within our own culture. You know, Lord Riven is a Scotsman, English Scots, and he, preys on people in England and wherever else he happens to be. But with Dracula, we start to see the invasion from the East, the vampire as foreigner. And that, of course, very unfortunately, got mixed up into anti-Semitic literature in the Nazi period and beyond. Okay, so, but beyond that, and here is where it gets really interesting, and the subject of my talk, mainly, late in the 20th century and early in the 21st, something extraordinary started to happen. Jewish vampire literature, or JVF. So as I was saying at the opening of this talk, as a writer who was inspired to write about a Jewish vampire, I started doing some research. And what I found, well, let me read the introduction here first. Jewish vampire fiction is an ambiguous phrase. Does it mean fiction about Jewish vampires or Jewish fiction about vampires? In other words, in this case, it can mean both. My definition here is as follows. Jewish vampire fiction, or JVF, consists of works in which Jewish religion, culture, and history feature as strong themes and settings, and in which vampires appear either as Jews or, less commonly, as close Gentile associates or co-protagonists alongside mortal Jews. For the most part, this discussion will focus on the former category, i.e. literature featuring Jewish vampires. However, at least one novel, Helen Shankman's The Color of Light, falls into the latter category. A Gentile vampire falls in love with a Jewish heroine. And it raises some of the same questions as fiction featuring Jewish vampires. Okay, so as a writer in this genre myself, I started to do research to see if other writers had gotten similar ideas. And to my relief, I discovered that they had. So let me just show you the titles that I brought with me. Are You Kosher? Memoirs of a Jewish Vampire. This was kind of amusing. Not one of my favorites. I'll show you which one of my favorites are. This is one of my very favorites. Erica Monford's Interview with a Jewish Vampire. And it's a very humorous book, but it's also serious in the sense that the characters draw you in and you identify with them. Because remember, when I say serious fiction and serious characters, doesn't mean it can't also be humorous. What it means is that it's not just a joke. It's not just for entertainment. It's also about, teaching us something about being human. And so this book is, just sparkling with humor. And it features a guy who's a Hasidic rabbi who was changed by some malicious person who didn't want him to, keep kosher. And so he's forced to live on the blood of rats, actually. What's particularly funny is he goes to a group called Bloodaholics Anonymous. And people in there go around, it's like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. They say, hello, my name is Jerome and I'm a bloodaholic. And they make sure that they don't get out of hand because they can injure and sometimes even kill people if they get out of hand. But they have ways of controlling themselves. So, let's see here. Now this book is an anthology, and the one that's most interesting in it, from the point of view of this subject, is called Blood Libel. So you don't see it here, this is just the cover. But Blood Libel is a short story about a young man who is in a pious Jewish community, and he gets changed, and he has to flee his community, and he comes into a wiser rabbi in another community who enables him to live by drinking small amounts of blood from willing donors. And the story is actually deeply moving. It's about how this young man comes to terms with what he is and the fact that he can't keep kosher anymore. And there's all kinds of bit of Talmudic wisdom and Jewish lore worked into it. And so, very interesting story. It's titled Blood Libel again. And this again is another anthology. It's volume 2, as you can see, in a series. This series, The Vampire Archives, is also released as a 1-volume, depending on how much you can lift at once. So you can get it in 3 volumes or 1. And the first story here is called Down Among the Dead Men. And that brings us kind of full circle to what I started out with, which is that most pivotal event in Jewish history, which is the Nazi Holocaust. I started writing my story about that, and this story is a very similar thing, only it takes place in the men's camp, and there's a Jewish character in there, only he's not the main point of view character. The main point of view character is a non-vampiric Jew who's afraid of this guy and wondering, you know, is he good, is he not so good? And the answer is for me to know and you to find out. So one reason, in fact, that I gave you a handout is so that you could see the titles. All the titles that are in my, okay. All right, I mentioned this one earlier, The Color of Light. This is a very long novel, and it's about a Gentile vampire who falls in love with a Jewish heroine. And there's a flashback scene into the Holocaust years in which this Gentile vampire becomes a righteous Gentile. I didn't like all aspects of this novel, but it's interesting. It's also about art, and the writer is an artist as well as a writer. This is her cover art, and it's really haunting. It shows this figure here, and following him is a ghostly figure of a woman, his long-lost sweetheart. So the parts that are the flashback into the Holocaust scenes are, for me, the most powerful. It was worth reading the whole novel just for those. So, and let's see. Okay, this is just the back of some of these. I think we're just about at the end of the slideshow. Oops, there's one more. The Last Jewish Virgin. This is a weird one. I have to thank my cousin for introducing me to this one. It's basically very funny, and it seems to want to be a romance comedy, but I had a very strange reaction to it because I thought the ending was disturbing. I thought it worked more as a horror story than as a romance comedy. And what's weird is I got the feeling that the author didn't intend that. I'm not even sure what the author intended. So if you want to read this and tell me what your reaction is, I'd be fascinated, because this is one of the weirdest novels I've ever read. The title would lead you to think that it's, okay. The title would lead you to think that it's a romance comedy. Okay, the last few are just the backs of these, and I rather than reading from the blurbs, which I thought originally I would do, I thought I would read some of my favorite passages. I could open Interview with a Jewish Vampire just about anywhere and have a riot of a time. And so we had met through J-Date. I was a Jewish divorcee of 41 who claimed to be 35 and might have been considered zaftig if you find that liberally, meaning somewhat flabby. He had been dead for a long time, but I didn't know that right away. I just thought he was pale, an undead double for Jeff Goldblum. He was tall, slender, with a mischievous smile, flashing green eyes and long black hair. His incisors were kind of pointy when he smiled, and his skin was pasty white, but that didn't put me off. Everyone looked pretty sallow in the dead of winter in New York City. I immediately wondered if I could drag him off to my lair later that night. And I was perched on a bar stool too teeny to accommodate my rear end, which spilled over the edges. I peered at everyone else's bar stools and felt worse seeing all those visible edges. I decided that from now on, my goal in life would be to sit on a bar stool and be able to see the edges. I tugged on my low-cut tunic top, trying in vain to hide the bulges between chest and crotch, which seemed to have a mind of their own, ballooning out despite my best efforts. At least I was showing some cleavage, my best physical attribute. He rescued me from what was rapidly becoming a severe fat attack. "So, you're a journalist," he said, putting his elbow on the bar, turning toward me. I had listed that profession on my profile. "Do you have a tape recorder with you?" he asked, not realizing, I suppose, that tape was so last century and reporters now carry digital recorders. "Why do you ask?" "I would like to give you the story of my life." He leaned forward and gave me such an intense look I had to turn away. "Would you be willing to interview me?" Sure. What's so special about your story?" I asked wearily, disappointed that he was only interested in my writing skills, not my body. "I'm a vampire," he said matter-of-factly. "Sure, and I'm Queen of the Damned." "What will convince you?" he asked. Hold on a minute," I said, playing along. I dragged a cross out of my purse, which I happened to have because I visited St. Patrick's Cathedral with my niece earlier that day and got one for free. I held it up in front of him. I'm a Jewish vampire. Doesn't do a thing for me. How about a Jewish star? Don't be silly. Only Christians are afraid of the devil.
Sorry.
I'm delighted. You're supposed to laugh. So later on, what does she do? She introduces Sheldon is his name to her mama. And that is in chapter 13. So, okay, and there's stuff about how they had to, get his coffin into the luggage section on the plane, and really funny things like that. So here, we're at her mother's house in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We sat down on either side of her on the couch so she wouldn't feel that she had to get up. Rhoda, what is this creature? I told you, Mom, he's a vampire. He's also a diamond cutter, for a living, that is. You couldn't have found a vampire doctor? She tried to make a weak joke. I guess if you love him, I can deal with him not being human. At least he's Jewish. Now that's a Yiddish mama for you, isn't it? Okay, so that's the funny stuff. But it does get serious too. And there are interesting things about the ins and outs of this relationship. So, another far more serious one is Down Among the Dead Men, which is very similar in a lot of ways to my character, because both take place in Nazi death camps. This one is in the men's camp, and one major difference is we don't really know, until the end practically, whether the vampire character is good-hearted or evil. In the case of Shoshana, the character who came to me, we know right off the bat. Did I say right off the bat?
You did.
Oh.
You did.
That was on purpose, actually. Every pun intended. We know right off the bat that she's good because she's the central character. And she's the point of view character. But the writing in here is just incredible. So let me find. Let me find one of them. I had it marked, just one moment here. Okay. Brookman, who is the main point of view character. Brookman raised his head then, and they stared eye to eye for a moment. Even knowing what he knew, Brookman found it hard to see Vernick as anything other than what he appeared to be, an aging, balding Jew, stooping and thin, with sad eyes and a tired, compassionate face. So that's what this vampire looks like. He also makes this remark. The vampire says, can you really call me a monster? Aren't I still a Jew, whatever else I might be? Aren't I here in a death camp? Aren't I being persecuted too, as much as any other? Aren't I in as much danger as anyone else? If I'm not a Jew, then tell the Nazis. They seem to think so. He paused for a moment, then smiled wryly. And forget your superstitious bogey tales. I'm no night spirit. If I could turn myself into a bat and fly away from here, I would have done it long ago, believe me. Just to give you one more idea of the poetry of this guy's writing, near the end, time seemed to stop. Brookman waited, stretched out along the hard floorboards, the raw wood rasping his skin, dust clogging his mouth and nose, feeling as though he were already dead, a corpse laid out in the rough pine coffin, feeling eternity pile up on his chest like heavy clots of wet black earth. Outside the hut, the Klieg's blazed, banishing night, abolishing it, but here inside the hut it was night. Here night survived, perhaps the only pocket of night remaining in a Klieg-lit planet, the shafts of light that came through the slatted windows, only serving to accentuate the surrounding darkness, to make it greater and more puissant by comparison. Here in the darkness, nothing ever changed. That's incredible, feeling eternity piled up on his chest. I mean, that language use. And so finally, I'll just read a few passages from my own writing. A vampire in Auschwitz. Shoshana's main problem is that she feels Well, one of her problems is that she feels guilty for having changed herself in a way that makes her unable to keep kosher and unable to keep the laws. That's one of the biggest problems any of these Jewish vampire characters face. Another is though she has a sense of survivor guilt because physically she's a lot better off than her companions in the barracks. And also, let's see. She has trouble finding meals in a way that is in concert with her conscience, because it says, nourishment was not easy to find, especially for an estrier, that's a vampire woman in Yiddish, with a conscience. Nourishment was not easy to find, especially for an estrier with a conscience. The most comfortable sources of it, guards and compos, were not readily accessible when asleep. Leaving the barracks at night was a crime punishable by death, but getting caught was the least of her worries. Her natural affinity for the shadows and the cloaking spell in the lighted areas would solve that problem. No, the real challenge was energy conservation. The cloaking spell itself required little energy, but when it was added to that of trudging in her compromised condition through the mud and sometimes rain to another building, such as the officers' quarters, and losing precious sleep time, the total would most likely exceed the energy in the blood, even if she drank a prodigious quantity. Thus, the easiest prey were fellow prisoners in the barracks. However, the thought of giving them a deeper sleep and a gentler dream than usual could not always entice Shoshana to take blood from women who were already so overworked and undernourished. Hence, she took only very small amounts and only from the strongest prisoners. Silent, formidable, guided by scent and nocturnal vision, she stalked, cat-like, through the dark building, feeling something predatory arise in her bosom. At times it alarmed her, other times she was worried by her lack of alarm at it. Thirst, such intense, painful thirst. Thirst, such intense, painful thirst. While others endured the ache of hunger as well as thirst in their stomachs and guts, she was parched, burning, and in the bunks lay the warm running brooks with which to quench it. How grateful she was for Lena's wise advice about placing her hands on each sleeper as she fed. For as soon as she touched them, she connected with them empathically. She remembered their names and her own. Was it normal for her kind to think this way? To see little more than a food source as she looked down upon these pitiful, helpless creatures lying before her? Living blood still had its most important ingredient, a spark of life, and a depleted spark was still enough to maintain most of Shoshana's strength. Thus again she felt plagued with survivor guilt for her unfair advantage. And so she has all these questions that she wrestles with, like, who should she give her food to? Should she give it to the weakest prisoners? That's her first impulse, because that's the compassionate thing to do. But then she thinks, well, maybe that would be a waste. Maybe I should give it to the strongest, because for them it might really make the difference between life and death. Whereas if I give it to the weakest prisoners, they might die, even with the extra food. So the plot of the story is essentially, how does she work out some kind of self-esteem in this horrible world? How does she get a sense of who she is? How does she figure out her own way of rebelling against Nazi tyranny? And in the end, she works it out. And so, I could read on and on from these samples and from this story. By the way, welcome to our newcomer. Came in a little bit late. Why don't you hand in this? That contains a list of the works I've been talking about. So, what I'd like to end up with is a few questions. Can these works truly avoid becoming caricatures or even inadvertently anti-Semitic? We saw earlier how Bram Stoker, who was actually a philo-Semite, consciously created a sort of anti-Semitic caricature subtly in Count Dracula, and that was accentuated in the movie Nosferatu. So are we contributing to that caricature whether we want to or not? Does this fiction trivialize the plight of Jews by bringing vampires, creatures of fantasy and the supernatural, into painful real-life situations, such as rape, and especially the Nazi Holocaust? And that's why, incidentally, I also brought up this novel, The Color of Light. Even though it doesn't have a Jewish vampire in it, it has a Jew who is a righteous Gentile during the Holocaust. And that raises some of the same questions. You know, by bringing vampires into the Holocaust scene, are we in some ways trivializing the Holocaust? Or perhaps are we making an even more powerful and memorable event of it by bringing it into fiction? So these are just some of the questions. And most important, do these stories have something meaningful to tell us about the overall experience of being human, Jewish or Gentile? Because ultimately that's what all good fiction is about. It's about the experience of being human. It's about making us wiser people in one way or another. You know, whether it's funny or solemn or serious and humorous or just serious without being humorous. Good fiction is about being human. And so at this point I'd like to open it up to the floor. And so, any thoughts?
As I said earlier, Shoshana's choices are the same, are in many ways similar to the ones that the human or non-vampiric people in those situations made. What choices do I make to stay alive for another day? I don't know if Shoshana has a partner, which Primo Levi pointed out was very important. You really had to have a helper to help scrounge food or pass on information or what have you. But she sounds, I mean, the choice is, you know, do I give my food to the weaker ones, or do I give it to the ones who can better use it? You know, do I want to give food to someone who will become what they called a Muslim?
By the way, that word appears in Down Among the Dead Men. Have you read this, Down Among the Dead Men? Okay. It's the main character is the mortal man observing this vampire who's in his block, a block being one of those low-lying buildings that the prisoners lived in. You know, he's constantly afraid of becoming a Muslim. That is an emaciated person who's like pretty much going to die.
No, they've given up hope.
Yeah, given up hope, basically. And one of the things that drains him is his fear of Vernick, who presents himself as a benevolent vampire, but Brooklyn isn't sure that he is, and Brooklyn starts losing sleep over it because he's afraid Vernick is going to attack him in the night and stuff like that. So, or he's worried that Vernick might attack him in the night. So, the word Muslim just reminded me of that. So, are you saying that Shoshana kind of brings out the plight of the real prisoners in a powerful way?
Well, it's interesting. When I first encountered this story, I thought the author, you, would be attempting to do something different because the character is a vampire. And after reading that, I thought, no, her situation is different, but a lot of the choices are very similar.
Well, is that good or bad, or neither?
That's fine. I just was making a comment.
Okay. Well, that would suggest that it's good in the sense that it tells something real about life and death in the camps. Any other thoughts on this? The biggest question that I had to wrestle with is, am I contributing to an ugly anti-Semitic caricature, even though that's the last thing I would ever intend to do? Any thoughts on that? You behind the camera, do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't think you were.
Oh, thank you.
I found the story very interesting. In fact, it was one of the ones that I enjoyed reading the most.
Yeah. Actually, according to the review, the one review that I got so far on this, and I'm not talking about on Amazon, on a different site, and according to people who have read it, whom I just know, it seems that the title story here, Heart of the Deep Cave, is the one they tend to like the least, which is not to say they don't like it, but they like it the least. Another interesting point is that the last story in here, which is called Away from the Light, and it's by far the longest, it's practically half the book. There is a Jewish vampire in there, but she's not the main character. She's kind of a secondary character. And there's a little bit about Jews and Judaism in there, but very, very little. The main character is a Anglo-Latina Tucsonan, who was raised Catholic but not very religious, and so her mentor is a Jewish vampire. But the reason I didn't include it in the genre of Jewish vampire fiction is that Jewish culture, religion, and history hardly figured in it at all. Very, very peripherally. So you might say it's on the border. It's kind of like straddling the genres of is it JVF or is it not JVF? So, any other thoughts on these questions?
I have one that's probably way off. Well, it's in topic, but not literary.
That's fine.
There's a tendency, I'm pretty well read with vampire stuff, and like there are articles that were literally started, was Lilith the first vampire?
Oh.
And I just wonder what your feeling on that is, especially because she was, you know, in folklore, the first woman created by God.
Very good question.
Adam's first wife.
Yeah.
I
Actually,
mean, she's not a vampire per se, but like, you know, she rebelled against Adam, rebelled against God, was cursed, and then like some of it's like, you know, some people have attributed blood drinking demons coming from being her spawn. So I was just curious where that plays into the whole.
I'm delighted you brought that
spectrum.
up. I'm absolutely delighted you brought that up because in this very story, the Estriers are described as the children of Lilith, or the daughters of Lilith, or the spawns of Lilith. And in other stories about Shoshana, she actually has dreams in which she meets Lilith. Those aren't anywhere near polished enough to publish. As I say, this started out as a novel, and I don't know if I'll ever finish it as a completed novel, or if it'll become a selection of short stories, or maybe a collection that sort of are novel-like. I've seen things like that. In fact, A Vampire Tapestry by Susan McKee Charnas is just like that. It's a collection of stories that pretty much stand by themselves, and yet they don't totally stand by themselves because they also form a kind of a novel. So at this point, I'm not sure exactly where the Shoshana material is going. All I know is she's very dear to my heart. She's like an alter ego to me. Sometimes I start talking in a sort of pseudo-Yiddish accent, and I become Shoshana, and I talk about April as my biographer when I want to be silly. Actually, not just when I want to be silly, but yeah, Shoshana is very dear to me, and this is the first story of hers that I've published. I have a lot of unpublished material on her, and in some of that, Lilith is a more prominent figure. And the first vampire, well, I don't know. There is a legend in a book, a medieval book called the Sefer Hasidim, or the Book of the Pious, about how vampires came about. And the story goes that they were created on the night of the first Friday, that is the Friday before the first Sabbath. And God didn't have time to finish them before he had to rest on the Sabbath. So they became perpetually incomplete. And that's why they need to feed on human blood in order to get whatever nutrients or life energy they need. And that bit of Judaic folklore is not in this published story, but it features here and there in the Shoshana material.
Does the story ever indicate what God was trying to create when he had to rest? What were the vampires intended to be?
I assume human beings.
Ah,
I can only guess. I don't even know if anybody knows that. That's a terrific question. You'd have to ask the writers of the Sefer Hasidim.
okay.
Was it
When I see them,
Pardon me?
Was it called the Book of the Pious?
Yeah, it's a medieval piece of writing, and I found a translation of one version of it, but that version unfortunately doesn't have the vampire passages in it. I don't know if there's in existence a translation of the complete version. There are translations of the vampire passages into English. I assume it was probably written in medieval Hebrew or something like that. So,
have any of the other writers of Jewish vampire fiction expressed concerns that they may be feed into an anti-Semitic stereotype, or have they, or is it actually implied in their writings or mentioned in their writings?
you know, that's a terrific question, and as far as I can tell, they're not worried about it. Like there's a, where was, oh, here it is. Interview with a Jewish Vampire has a preface. And as far as I can remember, I was just rereading the preface last night, the author is not at all concerned about that possibility. She just says she loved vampires from an early age, which I did. And, you know, she's Jewish. And there's so much satire about culture and the scene, the New York City scene, and so many piquant observations about people, Jewish and Gentile. It's really I love it. But she doesn't seem bothered by that. And the author of Blood Libel in this book, again, doesn't say anything about the story. It's just there's no preface or anything like that. So I haven't found any material like that. Not like I haven't been looking, believe you me. I've been looking all over the place. So I'm beginning to get the feeling that the answer is no. That you people are feeling like
I think it'd probably be subjective interpretation or speculation or whatever. I mean, like, when I first saw this, the reason I came is because I'm sitting there thinking, I don't think I've ever remembered Jewish vampire literature that I read about, so I was like, I have to come. But then,
great.
you know, I was talking about it with a friend of mine that's Jewish, and he was like, well, what about Count Orlok? And I'm like, before he mentioned that, I never really thought of the physical caricature of Count Orlok being like that. And then I said, well, maybe it was.
Okay.
Just because, like, you know, I mean, I've seen Nosferatu a few times. I'm a big fan of Shadow of the Vampire, like the making of the movie with the real vampire thing. And I never really thought about it. And then I punched up some old, Nazi propaganda BS from images, and I was like, Orlok kind of looks like that image.
Sometimes I not so fondly nickname the movie Nosferatu because his schnoz is more prominent than his fangs. Probably the only vampire I've ever seen. He's really the schnozola of vampire movies. Not so much in the remake done by Werner Herzog in 1979. There his fangs are more prominent. So that the remake I'm not too worried about, but the original 1922 movie is really, lots and lots of critics have observed, it's very much a Jewish face. And especially the schnoz. So that, and the scary, as I said before, the scary part is I'm not even sure it was intentional. I've been trying to Google around Murnau, anti-Semitism, and so far I haven't found anything that definitely says he either was an anti-Semite or wasn't. I did find an article that said that Bram Stoker was active in promoting Jewish rights. So he was definitely not consciously an anti-Semite, and yet the description of Count Dracula and his schnoz is a little bit uneasy, to say the least. So, did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if there are no further questions or comments, I could give my camerawoman a rest and we could get on with some book signing, if any of you feel like buying a book. How does that sound?